Greetings. Welcome to this Legal Lean Sigma Institute conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion and process improvement. We've been really excited to host this series of interviews on this topic. And today I'm pleased to introduce Mary Knightlick, who along with Audrey Rubin has led this fascinating series. Our guest today is Ray Williams. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. We hope you enjoy the conversation, and we welcome you to include your own questions using the chat. I will relay them to Mary and Ray either throughout the conversation or at the end of today. So Mary, my wonderful teammate, I'm so excited that you've invited Ray here today. I will let you guys take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It's my pleasure to have the opportunity for us to speak with Ray Williams today. Ray is, in my opinion, a very iconic person. He has taken the concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion and really folded in unconscious bias and has been doing this for, I believe, 10 years.
Yes.
So Ray, for 10 years, was the National Diversity and Inclusion Partner at DLA Piper. And he recently, after 10 years, said, thank you, when enough.
Thank you, next. Thank you, next.
Passed on the reins. But Ray's going to share with us what some of the accomplishments are, because it's not just a matter of DEI, but it's also looking at ethnicity and making substantive changes within the firm. And when you think about the size of that firm, right, like turning a battleship, and it's quite impressive. I thought maybe we could start today, and Ray, you could just give us a little bit of background and information, and then I'll jump in with a couple of questions for you.
Yeah, so Mary, thank you for that kind introduction. I have been with DLA for, this will be my 18th year. And really have been working in the D&I space for close to 20 years. And as you noted, I was the National Diversity and Inclusion Partner for DLA Piper. Along with that job, of course, I do litigation. I represent corporate America in the pharmaceutical medical device space, and the cool thing about that practice is it allowed me to actually bring two passions together. One is diversity and inclusion. The other is the healthcare, life science area, where now I get to work with organizations that actually look at the disparity in healthcare law relative to Black, Brown, Native, and quite honestly, rural communities. And so it's pretty cool being able to bring my life science healthcare background in with my D&I space background and putting that together for some work that we're doing to try and to improve those disparities in healthcare that relate to, like I said, Black, Brown, Native, and folks from rural communities.
Yeah, wow, that is quite unusual to take all that passion together.
Yeah.
When you started as the chair or the partner in charge of the diversity and inclusion, can you take us through what you saw were the major issues? And of course, 10 years ago, I don't think what law firms and people were thinking about is the same as it is today, but just generally over those 10 years, what are the major changes that you were able to create?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I come at this from an approach that might be different than most. I grew up very poor. I grew up in a very Black neighborhood, and I was able to, but I grew up in a two-parent household, and my father was certainly someone who had a big big influence on my life. Because I played football mainly, I was able to go to an affluent high school. And so it was there that I was able to see the differences, the similarities between those and poorer communities and those in affluent communities. And that was my first taste of diversity from my perspective. So when I went into the chair role at DLA, really what I was looking at was how do you get two diverse groups or three or four diverse groups to embrace each other. For me, I think that the inclusion aspect of it, the culture aspect of it was really important when I started.
So I think that that's extremely interesting. And I also think that as we have grown over the past couple of years, there's so much more pressure or so much more of a spotlight on DEI.
Mm-hmm.
But what you have done was starting this way before this intense spotlight. And I want to say, I think that the pandemic has just exacerbated this issue for people. And we have more and more firms signing the Mansfield letter and doing more things. But you have just created some amazing programs. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what you look at when you look back at your 10 years. What do you think are some of the biggest accomplishments that you have made with the firm, with embracing this and actually making substantive and real change, as opposed to just saying, well, we have a minority committee and we have a diversity committee, but what are we doing to help to keep and train and promote people from different types of backgrounds?
Yeah. So, as I look back on it, I think, we have to ask ourselves, what is your goal, right? For some people, the goal is to increase numbers. For some people, the goal is to increase business. And you can have any number of goals, whether it's a qualitative goal or a quantitative goal. For me, it was really about increasing the feeling or the culture of inclusiveness. So I wanted people to actually feel that they could bring their authentic self to work every day. And so I had to ask myself, and the firm had to ask themselves, and by the way, I probably should have said this in the beginning as a disclaimer. These are primarily my thoughts. I mean, we'll be talking about DLA, but this is Ray Williams talking to you, and not as a former partner, senior counsel, national diversity and inclusion partner. My role there is DLA. This is me talking to you. So what I really wanted to do, and what really was the biggest consideration, is how do you build an inclusive environment where someone feels like they can bring their authentic self to work every day. And so, for me, it wasn't about necessarily increasing numbers, and it certainly wasn't about the business case, because I think both of those come if you can build that inclusive environment.
That's a good point. That's it. Yeah, of course, one would follow the other. I was particularly smitten with some of the programs that you've done and some of the changes. Mm-hmm. What could you highlight 2 or 3 that you look back and feel like really have made a change, whether it's culturally or really increasing this more of accepting people and the whole diversity issue?
Yeah. So let me start with this, right? I think that in order for any D&I program to be successful, it has to start from the top. So Mary, I think you had noted this earlier, that DLA actually started this trip, I'll say, long before the pandemic. So I've been the National Diversity and Inclusion Partner, I was 10 years ago. And over those 10 years, and I would say certainly in the last 4 or 5 years, our chairman really got behind what we were doing, and really felt as though D&I was important, and in a culture of inclusiveness was important. So we started this trip some 4 or 5 years ago. certainly before George Floyd and the issues that transpired with the Asian hate and violence. And so for us, we really thought of this in terms of a holistic point of view. You know, we thought about it in terms of our workforce, which is our people. We thought about it in terms of our workplace, which is our culture. And then we thought about it in terms of our marketplace, which are our clients and our vendors. And so I'll talk about our workplace first, because to me, again, that's the most important. What does your culture, what can you do to improve a culture of inclusiveness? And so one of the things we did, and you talked about diversity and inclusion programs, and, you know, how many, committees do you have and the like. And so DLA, big place. We have 22 plus offices in the United States. And we have a national diversity and inclusion committee. We take a hub and spoke approach, meaning that we have this national committee that every one of our offices has a local D&I committee, and that local committee is headed by a chair and a vice chair. And every one of those committees are tasked with driving culture within the firm, one of inclusiveness. So what do we do from a national perspective as the hub? For every Heritage Month, we actually put on an event. So we do a national event during Black History Month and Asian American Pacific Islander Month, right on down to this past month in November was Native American Heritage Month. And that programming is for everybody in the firm. And it's usually a 1-hour presentation with a speaker or a panel of speakers. But we also ask our offices to do their own programming that's unique to their own city, and to include the entire office in that. So, you know, for example, we were celebrating Ramadan, and in our New York office, they actually asked if they could have an iftar, which is, you know, if you don't know, it's actually the dinner after the day of fasting. And we said, sure, do that, you know, please, you know, you should do that. And so I was in Philly, I went up to New York, I actually fasted the entire day. You know, and the iftar in the New York office had a presentation on exactly what Ramadan was, why Ramadan was celebrated, and what an iftar was, and all the things that happened during the day. And what was really cool to me was that we had an associate who was from Jordan. She was Muslim, and she celebrated or participated in Ramadan. And she came up to me afterwards and she said, thank you for doing this. Thank you for allowing this to happen. Because this actually helps me in explaining why I fast during lunch, and why I'm not eating during lunch. And I just feel like people are more accepting of me and my religion, because DLA has actually allowed an iftar to take place. So for us, it really is important that we're driving culture where people can actually feel like they can be their authentic self. And so I think that's one example of what we try to do in the workplace, and there are a number of other examples.
So one of the things that we frequently see with law firm clients of Legal Lean Sigma is that firms are struggling with how to get these things to be substantive. Mm-hmm. So you and I have spoken about some firms where it's just the diversity committee or the minority committee but when they look back, they haven't done the things you've done to be inclusive. And the first thing to understanding other or accepting other cultures is to understand. And you're doing an amazing job at doing that. How does that translate to then helping associates and partners to tackle one of the biggest problems that I think many of us see, which is the inclusivity of being part of the decision making or analyzing a case or going to client meetings and not just saying we have this committee, but actually doing something. And then the bigger issue that I think is the umbrella is what process did you use what was your process improvement like to make these kinds of changes that you've made? Because after listening to some of the stories, the Ramadan story is fabulous, and there are so many more about this inclusivity. And I'm wondering, how did you do that? How did the firm go through a process to make this change?
Yeah, I mean, so I think with everything, there's data, there's metrics, there's things that you have to do in terms of a self-assessment. And so even before, like I said, the whole George Floyd issue, his murder, even before the recent issues in terms of Asian Americans and the violence, we actually took a self-assessment. And by a self-assessment, I mean, literally, we hired an outside consultant organization, Jean Pigot, to speak to roughly 1,500 folks at DLA and just ask about our culture. Jean was able to spend roughly, I think, 9 months just assessing our firm. And she was able to tell us what, in terms of a culture, what she believed our firm's culture was. And by the way, this was done under privilege. So Jean was a lawyer, and so she did this under privilege. And in fact, that's some of the work that I do now is consulting with my clients to look at and assess their culture and their various offices and corporations. Yeah. And so from that assessment, okay, so now you have this assessment, what do you do with it, right? And that's really the question that I think you're asking is, like, in terms of that assessment, we then went to Kenji Yoshino, who is the director of the NYU School of Law Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. And we asked him to help us. Like, you know, you've done a lot of things, Kenji. You've spoken on unconscious bias. You've spoken on agility. You've spoken on allyship, and many other things. What do we do with this information? And Kenji has this theater-based training. And when I say theater-based training, I'm literally telling you that he put together a training program for us that had a number of vignettes, hired actors from Broadway. The director of the vignettes was actually the director of Motown on Broadway, and he took our assessment and he turned them into vignettes. And those vignettes were about inclusion and culture and you know, in some instances, biases that affected the lawyers at the firm. And we went on what I like to call a 5-city tour. So 9 months of an assessment, another 6 to 7 months of actually building out these vignettes, and then another roughly year of going around and doing some training through these vignettes. So the actors would act out the vignette. Kenji would discuss it with the audience, which was DLA folks, and then maybe the actors would do it a different way. So that was the first year of training that we did with our people at DLA.
Wow. Wow. So they went to many offices, and then were these live streams so people around the world could participate, or?
So it was US based, Mexico, so North America based. So we would fly people in to the cities.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if
Uh-huh.
it's in LA, we'd have a geographic region where we would fly folks in from, Mexico and Canada and Seattle and other
To
regional
participate.
areas to
So,
participate.
so the question I think that begs to be asked is, you had this wonderful program, you unearthed your culture, you had the training, you had the vignettes, but then to make a substantive change, we all know that just going through training one or two times is not going to shift people in a sustainable and deep way.
Yeah.
So you have been able to do that, though. So how did you go from that, and what was the process that you used to sort of say, we're changing, and did you have those aha moments from partners that sort of got it and realized their own biases that they hadn't realized before, and what was the process to make the change actually happen?
Yeah, so again, I think that you hit the nail on the head with that question. One training does not do it. Like the truth is that this has to be consistent, right? Training. And so, I would certainly say that we bumped up our last training, bumped up against the pandemic, more or less. And so, during the 2020 year and even into 2021, we've probably had close to 45 trainings that were available either in office or firm wide that continued on this, bias or unconscious bias training, continued on allyship training, continued on agility training, and things that really, I think, were directed towards our culture. Again, making sure that folks understood it. So yeah, at some point, partners or attorneys, associates, lawyers, the business professionals all had some aha moment where I think we were able to change the culture at the firm.
So it was sort of this combination of the training and then the recognition of these aha moments. Did partners, associates, professional staff at the firm, did they talk about what they learned or what change might have happened because of this? Did they ever have a chance to share these things?
Certainly. So one of the things that we did was after Kenji, and Kenji still is, we still have Kenji on retainer. He's still, part of our diversity team, as we like to call it. But we actually went to other consultants so that they could go into individual offices around the firm and continue the assessment. So again, one assessment 4 or 5 years ago is not sustainable. You have to continually assess yourself. And so, what we did is during the 2020 year, all the offices had we had the choice of 2 or 3 consultants who actually came in and spoke to the offices either in groups or individually and got feedback from them in terms of how they were feeling and what they thought about the culture. And again, that work was used to help Kenji do some more building of more vignettes and further training for the lawyers and professional staff at DLA.
I think the concept that you create these vignettes based on actual real problems and behaviors would make a substantive difference than if you had just kind of had the actors come in and act out like scenarios, but that you took the time to have people, the first consultant the woman, I'm sorry, her name just escaped me, but to meet with so many people to assess the culture and then actually have real things based on that went over years, it sounds like.
Yeah, no, that there's no doubt that that was very helpful to us. And her name is Jane. I might have said Jean, but it's Jane Pigot. Very helpful. And again, you know, you can't stay stagnant though. And I think that's the issue. Like these one and done trainings are not enough, right? You have to continue to change the training, tweak the training. You have to continue to tweak the vignettes, and you have to continue to assess yourself and figure out where you are. I mean, you know, one of the things that we discovered as a firm is that most of the power base in terms of work that is doled out to our attorneys or our associates is from the practice group leaders, right? Not from the offices. It was more the practice group leaders. And so, you know, if you were in charge of the corporate practice or the finance practice or the litigation practice, you know, you certainly were able to see how work was being given, whether it was complex work, whether it was work that was what I'll call grunt work, important client work, non-important client work. You could tell who was receiving that work. So we focused on the practice group leaders to drive initiatives into their practice group that was inclusive of everyone. And we called them action plans, is what we called them. And so every practice group leader was tasked with putting together an action plan that demonstrated inclusion.
So this is, you know, maybe going to sound a little tacky, but one of the things we know is that to change behavior, there have to be rewards for those behaviors. And whether those were monetary, was there part of a bonus that went to people if they did certain things to move this whole idea along? Or how were the partners and other people in the firm recognized for contributing?
Yeah, certainly, you know, it was part of the year-end evaluation. There was no specific number attributed to it, but you had to provide, every partner at the firm has to provide information in terms of what they've done to improve inclusion or diversity and inclusion within the firm. But no, to the extent that there was a carrot or a stick approach, we did not engage in that, and still have not engaged in that. I think, you know, for me, one of the satisfying, most rewarding aspects of what we did was to see those, what you called aha moments from our practice group leaders.
Yes.
I mean, and quite honestly, you know, again, I don't say this because any other reason than it's factual. Our practice group leaders were white males for the most part. And so to have them actually have these aha moments was really cool. I mean, I can't tell you how much it warmed my heart to see that, and
That's
to have. Go ahead.
I was going to say, it's an enormous amount of work and change. Well, the big question I think that a lot of people ask would be, well, let me phrase it this way. A lot of firms have difficulty maintaining minority and different ethnicity associates and partners, anyone who comes into the firm. Mm-hmm. They'll come and they sort of don't feel included. Perhaps they grew up in an environment where they didn't have a father or mother that was in business and could take them and teach them business development skills, for example. And so things just a lot of times with a lot of firms don't, just look at the statistics. I mean, yeah. They're not staying. Did you notice a change in the satisfaction of associates and people staying long enough to be promoted to higher level positions throughout the firm?
So the answer to that is yes. But I will say, look, we don't have goals. We don't have targets, quite honestly, I said this earlier, right? I think if you have an inclusive environment, your diversity numbers will go up. And so I personally do not. I think you have to have numbers to measure success, right? So to me, what's my baseline, and do I look 5 years out to see if that's improved? Sure. And so you certainly need that, but I don't know that that's improved for the sake of just having numbers. I think that that's improved because you have an inclusive environment. And so, I think most firms have this, and most corporations have what we call resource groups, what people have called affinity groups. So in addition to the 22 local diversity and inclusion committees, we have 8 resource groups or affinity groups, right? So African American Black resource group, Asian American Pacific Islander resource group, the Hispanic Latinx resource group. IRIS is our group for LGBTQ. Law is our leadership alliance for women. Mosaic is a group of partners and of counsel who are diverse. We have a veterans resource group, and we have a working parent resource group. And so all of those groups actually, again, allow folks who may be the 1 or 2 within their affinity in their particular office to reach out across the firm and feel connected.
It's so interesting how the different layers and the different ways you came about this. I have never heard anyone ever say that they had something like the Mosaic group where they took off counsels and partners from diverse backgrounds and kind of looked at that. So one of the things that seems to be important to us at the Legal Lean Sigma Institute is measuring change in process and having a process, and maybe even having process mapping to go through the steps so that you've made a change. Mm-hmm. You mentioned at the beginning that you have clients that you've worked with and had conversations about this, and that we see as one of the biggest areas that firms might be open to, where, for example, we might go into a law firm that invites some clients or a client and to work together to conquer and develop a process to make a change. And it could be diversity, it could be billing, it could be intake, it could be creating better efficiency. But specifically for today's purposes, you mentioned you've worked with your clients and wondering how they must feel so connected to you because they're having these problems. We know from a survey that came out in, I believe, July, that in-house legal departments are, even though they're demanding or expecting diverse numbers, real diversity, they're not doing that well at maintaining, keeping, and growing and promoting their own internal staffs. So what was it like when you would work with a client and have these conversations? And what did that do to enhance the relationship between you and the client?
So I think that everybody, everyone, every organization, whether it's the corporations or the law firms, are struggling with how to improve diversity within their organization. But the good news is that everyone's trying. I mean, everybody is trying. I often have conversations with friends about the reason these organizations are trying, but to me, the fact that they're trying is most important. So what do we do with our clients, right? So I talked earlier about the consulting that we do with our but more importantly, I have found over the last 18 months or so that a lot of change at least in the law firm arena is client driven. So clients are asking law firms, what are you doing relative to diversity and inclusion? But more importantly, how can we partner with you to make a change in the legal industry? Tell us things that you can do with us to make a change in the legal industry. So there are a number of things that we're doing with our partners, including presenting together on topics, whether that it's unconscious bias or it's, you know, the during Black History Month, I partnered with three of the firm's clients to just talk about the plight of Black lawyers in America, starting from the first Black lawyer to current day. To the other things that we do is we second lawyers to our clients. We build networks with our clients to talk about, you know, their networks in terms of their in-house lawyers and our associates who are of like age, juniors, mid-levels, seniors, and we try to put them in a room together to get to know each other. And so it's that, again, everything is about inclusiveness. Yeah, I think, you know, as we built out the mentoring programs within the firm for the resource groups, as we thought about the advisee programs for the diverse lawyers in the firm, you know, they say a rising tide lifts all the boats, right? And not only were those programs instituted with diverse lawyers in mind, but they were instituted with the entire firm in mind. And so now some of those pilot programs that were used for the African American resource group, everyone's using it, right? So it's being used for all the lawyers in the firm or all the business professionals in the firm. And so I think, you know, ultimately, when we talk to our clients, we talk to them about the things that we're doing to increase inclusion or the feeling of inclusion, to increase culture at the firm, and trying to help them do the same.
Do they ever come back to you after that when you shared, these are some strategies we've used to create better inclusion, to knock down unconscious bias? So they hear that, but do they ever come back to you to want to have a follow-up or work on that, or just even question you about specificity about next steps?
Yeah, so, you know, it's, again, I would say, as most folks at law firms in this D&I space know, clients are really pushing for there to be a plan, a D&I plan that is between the firm and the client. So to answer the question directly, yes, the answer is they are now. I'm seeing corporations come back and they're asking us to if we would please put on a CLE or some type of diversity presentation, if we can actually second lawyers to them, or if we can build a network of lawyers to meet and get to know each other.
Oh, how fascinating and really interesting. I wanted to segue a little bit to this bear of unconscious bias. So I shared a story with you, Ray, this week, actually, when I read the book White Fragility, and I saw that the author's first name was Robin. In my head, I was assuming it was a male, and I didn't realize it until I pulled it up on Google, and there was a woman, the woman who authored the book. And it smacked me right in the face about my unconscious bias. I always like to think of myself as having, you know, maybe littler or maybe not so much unconscious bias, but
yeah,
you know, if you have a brain and you've grown up and you have certain beliefs, you have bias. So what do you have? I stole that line from Matthew Cahill. I'm not sure if he's on the call today, but he has a company called Recipio, and they deal with this whole issue of unconscious bias for years, not just recently. It's kind of interesting. So just curious about any stories or anecdotes or advice that you could give to the people that will be listening to this to make me take some next steps that were proactive.
Yeah, so let me say this about unconscious bias or bias. It's not bad. I mean, I think people shy away from saying they have biases because they'll be considered a racist or prejudice or some derogatory term. And I want people to understand that having biases is just natural. It's naturally who we are, right? It's a uh, gathering, quite honestly, of your social upbringing, your influences over your entire life, whether it's 5 years old or 55 years old or 95 years old. You're going to bring your biases or thoughts into any situation that you have. So, with that in mind, accept it. It's hard for you agree with me, Mary, on this, that everyone has biases, but there are people who actually pride themselves on their ability to be objective. So they tell you they're colorblind, and 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 the reality is they're not. No one's colorblind. I'm not colorblind, and I can tell you a story. Let me give you a story of my own personal biases, and in terms of, I grew up in Rhode Island, in Providence, Rhode Island, and the first Asian family that I ever met was a Vietnamese family, and it was during the Vietnam War, when, similar to I guess what's happening with Afghanistan now, where we had refugees come over from Vietnam, and they did not speak English, except for the son, who was my age, spoke English, but it was very broken. What My first introduction. So I, over over my lifetime, expect that Asian people will speak with an accent, right? That's my bias. That's my bias. I recognize it, and I don't allow that to affect the decisions that I make. And that's all we're asking folks to do, is to recognize you have a bias. That's okay. That doesn't make you racist, doesn't make you prejudiced. It just is. Ask yourself if that bias if that bias affects a decision that you're making. They talk about the different types of biases. I mean, my favorite is the beauty bias, right? That, we all unconsciously notice people's appearances and somehow associate that with their personality, right? And so appearances are important, especially in the workplace setting. And so when you reflect on something like professionalism and self-awareness, many of us actually judge others too harshly, right? Based on their physical attractiveness.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think about a group of people that they hang with, and there's one particular woman who's that typical American blonde stereotype of the, 5'6", size 4, blonde hair, beautiful blue eyes, and I watch when she walks into a room how people respond, and they seem to be almost smitten with her. And it's a mind blow in this day and age when we're so conscious of this. But I don't even know if she's conscious of it or does it purposefully, but she flaunts it. And I wonder, how do we, as a culture, as an American culture, or any culture or group of lawyers or group of any people, how do we deal with that? I guess the first step is becoming aware that there's an issue, and then, oh yeah, I have this problem too, because we all want to deny it and say that we're colorblind. So did you have specific unconscious bias training as part of the great work that you've done at DLA?
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, again, Kenji did some unconscious bias training. I actually do unconscious bias training myself. So I do some of the training. We had other Brene Myers came in and did some unconscious bias training. So we had other consultants come in. So, and we continue to do it. It's not, again, you can't do one and stop. You have to continue to continue with the training. It has to be consistent.
Yeah, I mean, I think about an athlete, they don't stop being coached at any level, right? Even when you watch Serena Williams or any top tier mega athlete, I mean, you're constantly having to train and refocus. Well, what would you say that DLA, so if you were to go back and identify the 2 or 3 things that you feel the most proud of, I mean, I certainly think the things you've mentioned were fantastic, but I know in speaking with you, there are other things that you're doing as well. I think making the change and being able to reflect back on where we are and where we're going next, I guess, so is the new diversity chair at the firm, the partner in charge now, picking up the reins where you were and looking to, are there specific goals or objectives that you're hoping will be reached?
Yeah, so, for me, I think that you always need to be constantly moving. Things can't be stagnant. And not that I think that my role is a stagnant role in terms of the role at DLA. I think maybe I was becoming a little stagnant, but the role as National Diversity and Inclusion Partner requires innovation. It requires a passion. And I think that, Smitty, Edward Smith, who's taking over the role, has that. And has his own set of ideas and thoughts on how we move the ball forward. One of the things that we did was I talked about this thought process that a rising tide lifts all the boats, and that some of the things that we did from a D&I perspective, actually, we ended up using it firm wide. Well, so what did we do is we combined our professional development director with our chief diversity and inclusion officer, and we made a position called the chief talent and inclusion officer, and that person is charged with making sure that our D&I program and our talent programs or our professional development programs are aligned.
That makes a lot of sense. I wonder if there are other law firms. I'd be curious to know if any others have done that, because that's a great step forward.
Great question. I haven't heard of it, but it doesn't mean it hasn't happened.
Yeah, it would be interesting at the next Legal Marketing Association conference or Managing Partners conference or other places where we gather, whether virtual or in person, to kind of have that conversation, because I think that's a great step. Catherine, I wanted to ask you, do we have any questions or specific issues that we haven't covered that you think we should address in our remaining few minutes?
Thanks. We don't have any questions, but certainly as a member of the College of Law Practice Management Futures Conference Committee, I'd be remiss if I didn't seize the opportunity to invite people to attend our conference, the second part of which is taking place in January. One of the 3 topical areas on which we will be focusing is DEI. And so the framework of the conference is to have a short spark talk of a few moments, and then really engage in a lot of these discussions, because as you are illustrating so vibrantly, is we have so much to learn from one another. And the experience that Ray so kindly and generously is sharing with us, not only in his role as, in his firm, but how he grew up. and who he is as a whole person. And that we can bring and should be bringing, and our environment should be fostering the bringing of our whole selves from when we were born up until now. Those are the kinds of conversations that we're hoping to have. And so I love how you began, by saying, hey, this is where I'm from, because we all come from somewhere.
No,
We all come from somewhere.
exactly. And that is what we bring to this table.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful thing. And so if we create space, and that requires, obviously from our perspective, as Mary so deftly pointed out, for us, that requires process. And if you have a good process for this, it not only creates the framework for people to contribute and participate as their authentic selves, but we basically set the stage for continuous improvement. So I, in particular, appreciate your emphasis on this is not a one and done thing. Okay, we had these interviews, we did these skits, everybody learned, and now it's back to business as usual, or, we broke fast together, in Ramadan. And now, okay, that was great, and everybody back to business as usual. But this, to become a learning organization, to continue to, build this culture, and make it part of, I like how you started with, you've got to start somewhere. And so to break it from a national, to bring it down to the, everybody's got responsibility. There are go-to people within the office, but ultimately this is everybody's responsibility. Certain people are more accountable.
Yeah, completely agree with that.
RACI model of responsible, accountable, consulted, informed, but everybody's responsible for this. So creating good frameworks, creating the process for this, we think is sort of fundamental to advancing something that goes very directly to employee engagement and experience, client experience, and of course, the brand experience, what it's like to work with us. So I thought it was really fascinating, and I love these conversations. We have so much to learn from each other, and I'm confident that those who were lucky enough to join us today and who will be enjoying the recording will have some amazing takeaways, because certainly they can't lift what you did wholesale, but you've given us a wonderful blueprint from which to work. Everybody's in some stage of this.
Yeah, and I appreciate the opportunity to provide whatever I can to this important subject.
No, it's one thing.
Question myself, though. Oh, I'm sorry, Mary.
Oh, I was just going to say, it's one thing for us to hear about some changes in a firm, but when you look at a mammoth firm like yours and what you've accomplished, I think it's such a role model. Catherine, I think we should nominate DLA and Ray for a legal innovation award at next year's Futures Conference.
Why not?
Of Law Practice Management, because it's so comprehensive and long term. It's not just the one and done thing, and it's just right. I'm smitten by the whole thing. And what
I love the combination, right? Of to me, this is right at the nexus where my heart lives, is sustainability and continuous improvement. And that does require innovation. I'm fascinated by, I'd love to hear how that merger of roles has worked out for the firm. That intrigues me. I would love to hear a little bit more. If you're game to come back, I would love to hear your how did you become an unconscious bias trainer? And what did you need to learn to be able to do that? And what's that experience like for you? If you wouldn't mind saying just a few things about that, that is really fascinating to me.
Yeah, I will say this, that it was a dawning on my part at some point that we all have biases. It just, and this probably goes back about 20 years ago, Catherine, when I actually, so I'll tell you another story. There was my father grew up in Richmond, Virginia during the Jim Crow, right after, slavery, Jim Crow era. And was, I tell people this all the time. He hated white people. I mean, that was the bottom line. And so he grew up in Virginia. He moved to Rhode Island. He was in the Navy, met my mother, had us, and I grew up with that bias.
Yeah.
I didn't realize it, right? I didn't know it. But when I went to Pepperdine for law school, there was a guy named Tom Bright who was from Valdosta, Georgia, had the Southern accent. He was white. He was 6'2". We had a lot in common in terms of playing football and doing things. But when Tom actually wanted to hang out with me, I don't know. At the time, I didn't know why, but I would not hang out with him. I would not go anywhere near him. Now, I had white friends, but they were from the North. And I didn't realize that until years later,
Wow.
that for me, that uncomfortable feeling around Tom was my upbringing and my bias. And by the way, Tom ended up being in my wedding. Like 2 years later, I allowed Tom into my life, and he's been, such a great friend. But the reality was that I didn't realize that this feeling inside of me was a bias. But as I look back on it, and so quite honestly, as I look back on it, I saw a number of my biases. And I think when people are comfortable, like I am, explaining those biases and being, open with our own biases, it helps in terms of the bias training that I do.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, we're all human beings, and we're all just guarding our fragile hearts, really.
Yeah.
And so, it takes some practice getting comfortable being vulnerable. And we say the framework of process improvement and actually design thinking as well. The first steps are listening to the voice of the client or voice of the customer. The first step in design thinking is empathy. And so, being aware of your own, where you're coming from.
Well, there's no doubt about it. And you do have to be mindful of your first assumptions. And right, generally we're not, right? So the truth is, from an unconscious bias perspective, you can't untrain that bias, but you actually can be mindful of the bias. And so one of the things I do is I ask people for the next 2 weeks after a training is to notice and write down the first thought that comes to your mind when you encounter someone from another kinship group. For example, what's the first thing you think when you see an Arab name on an application? What do you do when you learn for the first time that your colleague is gay? What conclusions do you draw when you see a skin color, the slant of an eye, or anything? And just for the next 2 weeks, write that down. And you will actually start to become mindful of the thoughts that happen. And you can then recognize that you do have a bias, and that your goal is then to overcome that bias, not to get rid of it, because again, that doesn't make you a bad person.
Right. Well, we're all learning. We're all continuing to try and get better. Thank you so much, Mary, for leading this conversation with Ray. Ray, thank you for your generosity in joining us today. I hope you'll return. You are both an accomplished and a fascinating person to learn from and with. So thank you for sharing with us today. Thanks everybody for joining us. We hope you'll come back and participate in another one of these very important conversations. We're delighted to host them for you. Take good care.
Thank you. Thanks, Ray.
Thanks. You're welcome.